The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, and welcome back to the third lecture out of 4 for this titanic movement of Holst's planets, Jupiter, the bringer of jollity. So far we've seen a few different types of jollity, very upbeat laughter and almost like a horse race there in the middle, and also, it's kind of Christmassy jollity, and of course very impactful massive jollity. Now we're going to take a look at a different type of joy, which seems to be more reverent joy, giving thanks for the opportunity to share something human and real. That's the way I look at this. Of course, it was turned into a hymn, and that seems to have been at odds with Holst's philosophy. The very simple patriotism that is expressed in those words, I think, was probably a bit cloying to Holst. He was patriotic, no question, but he abhorred simplistic thinking. He liked to work on a deeper level, and I think that that's why this music comes off as so sincere and so honest, is that it is really coming from within. These are his own feelings about things, rather than him trying to get everybody else to feel what he feels. Now, we've seen different permutations of those 3 little notes that started off this piece. Bum, bum, bum. And this section is no different. Bum, bum, bum. Dun, 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 dun. Right? It's the same exact 3-note figure being reinterpreted this time as a hymn. This particular part of Jupiter is extremely quotable, and a lot of you may have been looking forward to see what the orchestration of it would be like if you hadn't done your own study already. What you're going to find today is that it's actually very direct scoring. There is almost no complexity to it whatsoever. I think that it would be too simple to say, oh, this could have been orchestrated by a child. Well, okay, in the first place, I've seen some orchestrating by children that is pretty immense and pretty phenomenal, having taught a few myself as a composition teacher. But all that aside, it's actually the directness and the simplicity and the effectiveness that makes this so grand. But it's not just orchestrating a hymn-like section. It's also a study in growing impact, right, and crescendo, and also in very, very straight melodic scoring. So keep all those things in mind as we proceed through this. Once again, we've got this standby of A6 horns being doubled by strings. In this case, it is all the strings on the same note. If you take a look at this, G, B flat, C, it's the same exact pitches with no octave doubling. So that's what gives it its intensity. Pretty much all the strings, except for the double bass, are writing on this note, and they're all doing it on extremely resonant parts of their instruments. In this case, we've got the G strings of the violins, and then right here, we've got the cellos playing over their tenor register very, very effectively. Now, as the melody rises, it goes across into the middle register of the violin, but what's interesting here is that it is crossing over into the more intense areas of the viola and cello. So that maintains the sense of urgency, right? It's a really neat trick, is that one particular register is going to push more than another when all the strings are playing this unison. And of course, as it gets higher, we see the cello getting up into its treble register, I guess you could call it, up into its treble clef area, going all the way up to E, in fact. And did you notice that he chooses the note C as the transition note up into treble clef. And that is actually a good place to start, I'd say, if you are going to use treble clef on cello. Now, of course, he ends up descending down to F and E and so on an octave lower, and then jumps back to tenor clef. And that's actually really, really good scoring, by the way. So Holst scores out the full phrase in treble clef before he jumps back to tenor clef. And that's really kind of the approach you should have too, because the player has got to think out all of their finger positions in a phrase, right? So if the phrase is all in the same clef, then it's just the easiest to process. Of course, not that this is very difficult music at all. It's pretty simple because it's so slow and it's so consonant, right? And it's pretty easy for the cellist to figure all this out, even though it climbs up into higher places, where it takes a bit more calculation. Meanwhile, over here in the horns, you can see that once again, the melody is scored over the span of the treble clef very, very nicely. In fact, the highest note here is G on top of the staff. At this point, the horns take on a more contrapuntal role, occasionally dipping into double parts of the melody, but mostly playing against the melody or supporting the melody or emphasizing certain notes in the melody. Jumping in to fill the gap is first trumpet and also three clarinets. And since the sound of the strings are so intense here, you have got 60 string players perhaps, all playing the same note. The trumpet won't necessarily be all that prominent. If you listen for it, you might hear the color of it just a little bit behind the violins. But notice how just one trumpet plus three clarinets is enough to stand in for the sound of these six horns, right? So it just really kind of shows you how powerful the heavy brass are. They could easily dominate everything. The trumpet player will usually find the exact balance of where to sit in this, so that they're providing just that extra push to the melody. Meanwhile, chordally, we've got harps and clarinets and bassoons, all providing this lovely minuet-like accompaniment. 1, rest, 3, 1, rest, 3. And this is a situation where the harps are going to start out with the best of intentions, and they're going to continue on and be very, very audible, at least for this page. And it's nice. It's sort of pianistic scoring, but it's still the kind of pianistic scoring that harps can do well. The notes sit under the hands very well. We've got octaves walking downwards. It's a little fiddly, but really not anything that's all that difficult, and it has a very beautiful sound. I wouldn't recommend taking this approach for your scoring all the time. That's the problem that I see in harp scoring a lot, is that it just really is big chords in either hand and independent motion and all these other kinds of things that are more typical for a pianist that work well on harp to a degree. But the problem is not that, really. It's the slippery slope that leads to more and more independence in the hands, more and more contrapuntal writing, more and more pianistic approach. So just really watch out. If you read this and you love it and you want to emulate it in your harp scoring, that's fine. But just be aware that this is a very basic support part. It's really not intended to be anything with a whole lot of focus. So it's written at a fairly simple level, I would say, but one that could easily be abused, especially passages like this. I see this and just kind of think, well, this is all right, but I've seen so many scores do this plus 10, right? And the harpist is just killing themselves to get it right, and nobody can hear them. So far, up to the end of this page, you'll be able to hear the harp quite well, in fact, because there are two of them, two harps. This is another place where you can use A2 as well as brass and winds, is if you've got the two harps, right? Then you can tell the copyist and the conductor that both of them are playing. As to the bass, which is our only other element, it starts off very simple. Pizzicato, double basses, and then as the music starts to get more intense here, it becomes arco, but not a big, huge difference in what's going on. And that's all doubled by the bass clarinet and the contrabassoon. And of course, the left hand of the harp, and so on. If I were to pick out what's most fascinating to me, I would definitely say that it is right here where the horns take on more of a contrapuntal support role. I feel that that is the strongest part of scoring in this entire page. It deepens the context emotionally. That's something that a lot of people don't understand about counterpoint at first. It seems like it's just some weird intellectual game, right? It's making sure that the notes line up and that certain rules are applied and everything else. Okay, fine. That is just the bones and the muscle of what counterpoint is. But if you take a broader view of it and really experience what counterpoint does with scores, you see that it really increases the emotional context of the work. Like I would say, for instance, that the point at which Mozart added more and more complex counterpoint to his works was the place where he really became a master composer. Going on to the next page here, we notice that the approach continues pretty much the same for the clarinets. However, the trumpets drop out at this point, and the strings continue on. And you might think, well, geez, aren't we going to lose some energy and impact there? Well, the answer to that is actually no, you won't, because there are certain notes of the melody that are being emphasized with that same minuet-like support, right? Now, right about here, when this becomes much more of a titanic tutti, this is the point at which you will stop hearing the harps. If that is so, and I'm sure that Holst well knew that his harps would become invisible at this point, then why does Holst let them continue to play on, sort of pointlessly, it seems? I think that it has to do more with the sense of unity that we're seeing as this piece goes along. Pretty much every instrument in the orchestra is engaged here, except for the kitchen sink percussion, the single-line percussion instruments. Holst wants the whole orchestra to unite in this big, glorious tutti right towards the end of the passage. So he is allowing the harpists to continue on playing. So the harpists actually have the best seat in the house. They'll be able to hear themselves play. And that sound might not reach more than a meter or two away from where they're sitting. But it still is pretty exciting for them to be kind of the center of this motion, I feel. That would be my estimation of what's going on here for the harpist. As to everybody else, notice that the strings just keep playing that intense melody all the way to the end. However, it gets to a point where they really have got to split up into octaves. So a couple of bars back, I forgot to mention it at the time, the melody split into octaves here, but nonetheless intense, I feel, especially as the violins are rising higher up into their ideal register. And this sort of allows the violas and cellos to inhabit the same essential registers on their instruments. Both of these parts rising up toward the A string as this melody rises up toward the E string. At this point, we start to get lots of support from the winds, and the texture kind of cuts like a knife, with A2 flutes, A3 oboes, and not always playing unison. At this point, the oboes drop down an octave to join up with the English horn. Clarinets are in that lower position with the melody, and so on. But essentially, these octaves in the strings are being observed. When we get to this point, it becomes a triple octave, because Holst just wants to spread it out, and to keep more in ideal registers rather than pushing the cello so high for no reason. And at that point, we have the horns come back in. So the horns are actually doubling the cellos, which is a really fantastic sound. And then clarinet is doubling the violas along with the oboes and English horn. And then, so far as the flutes are concerned, they are doubling the strings. And that is all pretty much a very classic strategy for doubling a melody. What's unique about this is that so much is dedicated to the melody. I would say throughout this entire passage, the melody really overbalances the entire function of everything else around it. So the support players could actually play out quite a bit without causing any damage to the melody because the melody is just so thick and huge. Another neat touch here is timpani coming in. Of course, if you got 6 of them and 2 players, it's not such a hard thing to double the bass line as it does for a lot of this. Not all of the walking pitches, notice, but just enough emphasis on the bass line to make you feel that it is really being pushed through. It has a real tympanic effect on your eardrums. And then, of course, here, this lovely way of wrapping it up with a sudden diminuendo and the timpani sort of pulling the energy back with its roll. That's something that you don't see that often. Usually we see the reverse, with the timpani rolling towards an increase of energy. But using the timpani to sort of moderate the feeling of losing energy, of releasing energy, I think is just a wonderful touch here. Speaking of that bass line, we have the double bass continuing on with the same support from the contrabassoons and bass clarinet and so on. Eventually the bassoons join in, A3. And we have some heavy brass support starting off, bass trombones, tenor tuba, and adding a bit of a pedal tone there as the rest of the bass line walks on. It's nice to see little parts of the bass line jump in to the upper voices from time to time, such as right here with first trumpet and first trombone. Then, of course, you can't beat bass tuba for a really huge, emphatic sound. With the way that this is scored, the tenor tuba can just take a break and not really worry about it. If you've got the bass trombone and the bass tuba in an octave, moving around like this, along with all the other weight that we've got, then, tenor tuba is just kind of superfluous until this big tutti at the end. One last thing to observe, and that is this sense of minuet-like harmony supporting the rest of the melody that's going on just falls to a very small amount of heavy brass. Once again, showing us just how powerful the heavy brass are. We've got tenor trombones and all 4 trumpets. Trumpets are also contributing something to the melody. The first trumpet is, anyhow. But the second trumpet is definitely playing more harmony in its function here. But that's all that's needed. So despite all of this huge scoring fortissimo, all it takes is just a little bit of heavy brass in there to make things right. Now, that might be a bit subjective, to be honest. The players might be achieving to what they might feel is closer to a fortissimo, but they will balance themselves out. This is a very common approach to score the heavy brass forte and the rest of the instruments fortissimo. And it does create a very nice balance, and that is if you don't want the heavy brass to have a prominent role. You'll still hear this trumpet, even scored at forte. You can hear it very clearly in a nicely balanced recording. And that's intentional. That's perfectly fine. It's going to be playing over the same notes as the violas, and that is an important factor in making sure that it doesn't play too loudly, right? If it is playing over the other instruments that it can easily swamp, like violas, clarinets, English horn, then there is some caution advised there, even though it's a single line played by a single instrument. So think about all those things. Think about the functions as you look at this, not just the big, huge texture. The texture is great. I mean, we all know it. We've heard it a zillion times, I'm sure. But we have to focus on why it works, right? So look at the functions of each of these instruments. Break it down. Texture, balance, and function. So if you think of what notes are doubling, what notes are supporting, what notes are just adding impact, then you can see right away that all of the instruments on this page could be boiled down to 4 hands of a piano score, which indeed they were arranged from. Think about all that, and then I will see you on the next screen. Moving on, we are going to run into a lot of recap material. So this is going to go a little faster in terms of my lecture. I don't want to overanalyze material that we've already gone over quite a bit, but I'll just point out some of the differences as we go. Coming out of that massive tutti, we have this lovely suspended chord here in the clarinets, along with the violins continuing to tremolo towards each other over the same pitches, notice, right? Everything is transposing to be read up a whole step. Now, this tails off into just 2 desks each of violins, so essentially you have 8 players here, right? So each desk has 2 players, 2 times 4 equals 8. That becomes the suddenly sparse background to just this very sprightly reminder of where we came from, right? Bum 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 bum, and that is traded off across English horn to clarinet to oboe to flute, and it's lovely to hear those different voices contrasted so nicely. Here's where I think the music gets cool. This oboe and clarinet unison, which you don't really hear all that often. It's something that's discouraged in orchestration manuals, despite the fact that it works actually quite well, just as long as you know what you're doing, right? It's like, watch out for that toy, don't point it at your dad, you know? It's that kind of thing. You have to know what you're doing to balance these nicely. But when you do, it has a very cool, rustic sound. Piccolo and flute in octaves, answering this little unison, then going into octaves with these intervals, expanding out into a more harmonic approach with the lower winds. And while this has been going on, this little whispering fingered tremolo has turned into just an unmeasured tremolo here, holding on to that idea of a suspended chord. And as we see, we're recapping a lot of this material, taking us back to where we started. Holst is getting us there by flashing through these, almost like flashcards, really. Like, remember this? Bum 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 da 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 da. Once again, finger tremolo behind it with a little triangle ting. And then returning to unmeasured tremolo, while the winds start to riff on this da 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 bum bum bum, and the da 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 da, leading us in this beautiful crescendo over the trumpet with a development of the melody. Bum 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 bum. Right? It's pushing us towards this titanic explosion here. Right? I love the way that it just comes out of nowhere and pushes this right in your face. Just bam. It just is suddenly this big tish on the cymbals. This is actually what you're going to hear the most right here, is this big crash. Triangle rolls have much less impact than they used to. For a while, they were discouraged because the sense was, oh, look, it just sounds like a telephone ringing. Now that we've got telephones, it's a very similar sound. But I'm feeling that the 20th century orchestra got so big and so loud that it's very hard to hear triangle rolls at all anymore. So that would be the main reason why I would discourage their use, not because they sound like a telephone now, but more because that it's really easy to get lost. Here, I think coming off of the tish of the cymbals, it's almost a way of maintaining the metallic edge of that cymbal crash, right? And we've got bubble 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 going on in our upper winds here. Piccolos and flutes very, very close together, almost looking like a unison on the page, but of course playing different cells of that motive. Bum bum bum. Then the oboes playing the same cell, E, G, A, that the flutes are playing, but off a 16th note against them. And the A3 clarinets are joining in, and they are playing the same fragment as the piccolos, only once again off by 1/16th note. And it just gives that kind of wonderful blasting around, not really the ear being unable to really process exactly what it's hearing, kind of an effect. And those same little bits of motive are being doubled by the strings. At different places, by the way. This is kind of neat that the violins are essentially doubling the piccolos from below, right? While the first violins are doubling the same notes as the piccolo from below, an octave. And then the seconds are playing the same notes as the oboes, and so on. And then the violas are doubling the same pitches as the clarinets from an octave below. And that gives it a little bit more depth, right, as opposed to them all doubling exactly at the same pitches. So, balancing out a wallpaper idea like this doesn't have to all be all unisons, all, at pitch all the time, right? There are ways of building it out so that you've got more depth, more breadth to the texture. But that's just taking pains, right? The functions here are really returning back to the beginning of the piece, but interpreted in a different way. We've got that bum 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 played by all the heavy brass along with the lower winds and English horn. And it is a really massive sound. Once again, timpani doubling the melody played low, not to mention the lower strings. And that's a good reason why most of the strings are helping out this part of the texture. It's just simply so that they will be audible. My favorite part of this page is right here, where everybody just goes for it and climbs up as far as they can. And how the timpani kind of covers some of the same notes as things rise and gives it that huge push. By the time you get here, though, really, the timpani's not needed at all. This is really a lovely unison, the way that it's scored. Triple octaves at the strings, with both groups of violins playing the same notes, and the piccolo reaching all the way up to this beautiful high G, and then jumping back down an octave, because it really doesn't matter. You get to a certain point, if the piccolo were to really stay on top an octave, then it would start to screech. G is a good upper limit if you want to stay away from very ear-splitting sounds. So the piccolos jump down immediately to double the flutes, and you don't even notice that there was a compromise in the strict octaves. Now here, this is what I feel contributes to the whole idea of forte piano crescendo on that big opening tutti chord at the beginning, because something similar happens here, except without the forte accent at the beginning. And then this is pretty much the same. Bum 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 bum. Let's listen to all of those bits and pieces. And what I would say is listen for the difference. Look at the difference on the page and how Holst reuses the elements, but in nice, fresh ways. Not so fresh that we can't just breeze over it a little bit, but fresh enough so that the differences can be pointed out as unique elements of orchestration. And then I'll see you on the next screen for the final part of our lecture. Now we're back to that bum 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 idea in the horns, 6 horns, supported by tremolo in the violins. Then we've got our bum 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 happening in the violins, supported by a chorale of clarinets and bassoons that fit in so seamlessly that it just feels like a fatter, more intense, cutting string sound. We've seen this before. We studied it before. It's not all that different. And in fact, pretty much the rest of this lecture is going to cover material that's very, very familiar. There are going to be some differences in possibly different pitches, right? The melodies are going to come back in different places, and the positioning of the register will provide slightly different choices for some of the textures that are going to be set up by Holst. I like little touches like this. Bum, 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 dun, 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 dun. That's all very, very cool. Giving us an extra octave. And then, once again, using the slight random quality of these upper winds kind of exploding outwards. Then we've got our bum, 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 dun, 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 and then changing into like a little strings plus middle winds kind of chorale idea, and then bum 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 bum, and coming back to this, the horns being answered by the trumpets, and the trumpets adding on more and more voices until it gets very, very, very big with these tremolos and our kind of random sounding wallpaper here in the winds. We've seen all this before. It's just fun to see it again, and notice a few slight differences here and there. I like the cymbal roll. That's kind of cool. Once again, bum 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 bum. The treatment is pretty much identical. Straight unison of all the strings. And boom chick with the trombones and bass tuba. One difference here, and that is the length of time that Holst takes to set up this big sweep up to this section here. It's 2 bars or 1.5 bars instead of just kind of a half a bar like before. Once again, the slightly cloying Christmassy music Christmas shopping music, which I like to think of this as. And this is all pretty much the same as well. One of the differences here, as I was saying before, and that is that the change of pitch allows for different textural choices. In this case, there is a different register of upper winds being played. More piccolos are involved right from the beginning, and this little tingly glockenspiel gets even higher than it did before. Other than that, I would say there really is not a huge difference. So anyhow, have a listen to that, and I will join you in a pretty short amount of time, probably just maybe 2 or 3 days on Patreon, although for a regular YouTube release it might be more like 2 or 3 weeks. And I hope you enjoyed that, especially the beginning of the lecture, probably the most interesting part, because this recap is done in a way that is so recognizable that there probably isn't a whole lot of point to going over it in detail, as I said before. But there will be more new sections and new treatments of old material that will be coming your way in the next lecture. So wait for that, and we will wrap up this piece and move on to Saturn very shortly. Really, really great to be with you today, and I will see you again soon.